I started out in oncology when oncology was really a very young discipline. Only about 30 or 40 drugs were available to treat oncological diseases. There was very little in the way of specialization and the way of tumor types. But I was fascinated really by the fact that it was a young discipline. And as a young physician starting out, it was an excellent opportunity to get in on the ground floor of a growing discipline. Now, oncology represents 40% of all the pharmaceutical activities, and medical oncology has blossomed. It's one of the most popular subspecialties in internal medicine, as you're well aware of. Very high quality of people are going into the field. The pharmaceutical industry has taken an intense interest in this area, as evidenced by the fact that we routinely lead the FDA in oncology as far as the number of new approvals, ranging anywhere between 12 to 15 per year of new molecular entities. And in addition to that, lead in the number of breakthrough therapies. And a lot of this effort has been because of basic gains in our understanding of the diseases on a molecular basis, our understanding of tumor immunology, and really the underpinnings of cancer, which led to very important drug discoveries. When I was at MD Anderson as a professor, I was working with many pharmaceutical companies and developing drugs, and had done drugs development both in the phase 1 study in GI malignancies and in phase 2 studies, and ran some phase 3 and even adjuvant trials. And with these companies, I came to the FDA. And I really understood the importance of the FDA in having a major impact on drug development in oncology. And I don't think that that was that well recognized by many in the academic oncology community at that time. So when a position was open here, I applied for it, and obviously I went through a competitive interview process and was chosen to lead then a division, because we were really only 10 medical oncologists, and now we have a whole center with over 100 medical oncologists, including pediatric oncologists, radiation oncologists, surgical oncologists, et cetera. And that growth has spanned a period of really 24 years now. I'm going to be starting my 24th year here at the agency. And many people realize this. My wife passed away from ovarian cancer, and it's been 8 years ago since her passing. In fact, sadly, Thanksgiving of this year, 2023, will be the day that she passed away from ovarian cancer. And having a spouse that has cancer really puts a very different perspective, not only on one's profession, but also on one's personal life, because you really see the side effects of many of the cancer therapies that we have, the things that patients go through that physicians really don't see. Physicians don't necessarily see what goes on behind the scenes at home with patients, so to speak, and the real aspirations of what people want. When I began on oncology in the late 1970s, I thought oncology would become basically an academic discipline where almost everybody would go on a clinical trial because the drugs were relatively ineffective. Let's face it, we didn't have many curative therapies at that time. So it has remained relatively low. And I can't underscore the importance of patients participating in clinical trials. They've evolved, they become more complicated, and in some cases, way too complicated. And that's why we've begun projects such as Project Pragmatica in the Oncology Center of Excellence, looking at pragmatic clinical trials. What is the basic question that you're trying to answer, and what is the simplest way of looking at that question, and what is the minimum amount of data that needs to be collected? I want to emphasize that our interest, or my interest, I should say, in international oncology trials really stemmed back to when I was a clinical investigator, because I was working with many companies in Asia as well as in Europe. So I completely understood the need and the benefits that one obtains in doing multi-regional trials throughout the world, okay? Our regulatory interest in multi-regional trials, or I should say in international collaboration, and let's address that first, really began almost 20 years, 20 years ago, because we began our pilot program in 2004 with the European medicine agencies, where we met on a monthly basis to really discuss clinical trials and applications that came forward to us. And that was called a cluster call. And that cluster call rapidly incorporated additional trials in countries, I should say, including Health Canada, Japan, Australia, and Switzerland, and remains very active even today. During that period of time, I noticed that the US received applications from the pharmaceutical companies much earlier than any other country. And that obviously is for financial reasons, because of the large market and lucrative pharmaceutical market here in the United States. Nevertheless, some of these smaller countries, such as Canada and Australia, receive these applications sometimes with a very significant delay, sometimes up to a year or several years. And I thought that this was really not an optimal way of developing drugs on an international basis. And so what we did is we moved to this concept of Project Orbis, okay, which would ask pharmaceutical companies at the time that they're submitting to the United States to submit also to the Orbis partners, if they would be agreeable to that, these countries and the regulatory agencies. So we would have relatively near simultaneous submissions, and then we would work on these submissions together. Okay, they would have the benefit of receiving the expertise of the FDA. We have, as I stated before, over 100 medical oncologists, and they're specialized in various disease areas: breast cancer, colon cancer, acute leukemia, you name it, very similar to Memorial Sloan Kettering and other major cancer centers. So we have that expertise in-house. The other regulatory agencies simply don't have that for the most part. And therefore, we work with these applications, and this has become a really successful program. At the present time, I took a look at some of the numbers in preparation for this, and when one takes a look at the 23 this year, basically, the number of regulatory actions from the start of the program in June of 2019 to June of 2023, we've almost had 350 regulatory actions among all of the countries, and almost 400 or over 400 submissions, and some of these are obviously still ongoing. And it's very interesting that behind these numbers are very important facts. And here again, numbers are numbers, but I want to give you some feeling of what goes behind the scenes, behind these numbers. These applications are really important drugs. These usually are breakthrough therapy drugs, drugs that have demonstrated survival impacts on patients, or meaningful, very meaningful impacts, either first-in-class drugs, drugs that offer therapies where there is simply no other therapy available to patients. So behind that number is really countless numbers of patients within all of these countries that we have in Orbis. And I think that that's an important point to realize, that there's faces behind these numbers, and literally thousands of patients that have benefited by this simple task of just asking pharmaceutical companies to submit simultaneously or near simultaneously, concurrently, to the US and our partners. China represents a very major factor in drug development, major mover in drug development, not only in terms of patient numbers, in the ever increasing quality of clinical trials that are coming into the clinical arena here. So it is an area that I personally would like to see further discussions on. Obviously, as everybody knows, there are certain tensions that exist now between China and the United States. And here again, this might be a very optimal time to look at cooperating in a healthcare venture to smooth out some of these issues. I think it's an important move. I think it also reflects some of the additional features of Project Orbis, and that is also some of the streamlined reviews that we do, and the importance really of early discussions of clinical trials and where we're going on an international basis with this. Okay, it is a factor that needs to be explored and really developed more fully. We've recently developed some additional meetings with the EMA to talk about the scientific advice that we give companies earlier on, before the clinical trials are actually conducted. So we are really in sync between the US and the EMA on clinical trial design issues, and especially if they involve innovative endpoints or innovative clinical trial statistical methods. You know, obviously we have a whole program here called Project Equity in the OCE, which has worked and has spearheaded some of the agency's initiative on development of diversity plans for US submissions. But I'd like to emphasize, and I think this is an important point that we emphasize this, is that for us really in the United States to achieve equity here in clinical trial participation, we also have to consider that this is a global problem, and true equity in clinical trials here in the United States has to take that into account, that we will only achieve equity with achieving global equity in clinical trials. I also believe that we should, when we take a look at multi-regional trials, which is the preferred way of doing clinical trials for drug registration, try to develop sites in Central America and Mexico, as well as Sub-Saharan Africa. And that may help us address some of the intrinsic issues with racial and ethnic diversity that we encounter here in the United States. For most of you that are familiar with this topic of diversity, we frequently talk about intrinsic differences and extrinsic factors in ethnic and racial diversity. Our participation in multi-regional trials should not be looked as a negative aspect when one talks about diversity, because if we're really trying to address the issues here, and really the questions, it's not simply about the numbers of patients in the United States. It's really about what the questions are, and are we answering the questions? And I think we have to ask those questions, and it's not just a numbers game. As we mentioned at the beginning of our talk, there's money issues behind the numbers. Really, our goal really has to be, as a participant in multi-regional global trials, because we are much stronger working together. It brings confidence in the system, and especially as countries emerge more into the global arena here, we get confidence in our regulatory decisions by bringing these countries into multi-regional trials, because then we're able to analyze the data from a specific new country compared to more well-established clinical trial sites. So there are many advantages of participating in bringing new countries in, and this is going to be a really important aspect as we move forward in understanding new drugs and new therapies and how to move them as expeditiously as possible to the right patient and in the right disease setting.